After crossing the Hellespont and winning the battle at Granicus, Aleksandr Makedonsky almost immediately became the master of the most important trade route through the strait between the Black and Mediterranean seas. But from the very first words of Plutarch, we realize that something is wrong, something doesn't add up. Hello, this is Epocha Nedovaria, and without further ado, we continue our story. After the rather strange and ambiguous battle on the Granic River, Aleksandr turned his troops to where he should have gone from the very beginning, to the Mediterranean Sea to capture the main port cities. Almost all of them surrendered without a fight. Only Halicarnassus and Milet put up resistance. There's not much to say about Milet. There was a small garrison there, which was quickly defeated. But the siege of Halicarnassus was much more interesting. Plutarch, in his biography of Aleksandr, using his usual disclaimer, doesn't write anything about this siege at all. They just took the siege and that's it. How? You'll find out why now, without unnecessary questions. Unlike the other cities that Alexander the Great had encountered so far, Halicarnassus had both strong professional troops, the most powerful support from the sea, and the strongest high walls surrounded by a deep moat. Plus, its location was so advantageous that it could hold back almost any army for a very long time and even turn the course of the war in its favor. Wikipedia tells us that the most advantageous place to set up camp was the eastern side, arguing that there were supposedly no mountains there. However, a simple glance at the satellite images is enough to see that there are mountains there. Yes, not only are there mountains, but the foothills are just 1,000 meters from the city walls. Considering that the flight of an arrow launched from the wall was more than 300 meters, maybe even 400, the Macedonian camp was left with only a tiny patch about 1.5 kilometers long and wide. Meters, 800. A 45,000-strong army could fit on it if each soldier were given about 20 square meters. That's not very much considering the supply wagons, horses, siege weapons, not to mention temporary housing. Well, all right then. As it turns out, right here, the Macedonians weren't afraid at all of the barrage from the walls and somehow just blindly filled in the defensive ditch. You're already laughing. Wait, it's about to get even funnier. It turns out that despite the filled-in ditch and the breaches in the walls made by siege engines, the Macedonians couldn't take the city because of the defenders' excellent preparation and determination. The outcome of the skirmish was decided by 2 soldiers from Perdica's regiment. In a drunken frenzy, they decided to storm the city together and engaged in combat with the defenders. Their comrades followed them in the assault, which ultimately led to victory. I read this and think, are these 2 really Greeks? It's true, they didn't have enough strength to hold on to the victory, and Aleksandr was forced to ask for a truce and retreat. Then, using battering rams, the Macedonians brought down part of the eastern wall, but the people of Halicarnassus managed to build another one behind it, even stronger than the previous one. With battering rams, the stone wall. Yes, even if the wall was half a meter thick, not a single battering ram would be able to break through it. Logically, the wall should have been even thicker. And why, instead of defending, did the people of Halicarnassus start building a second wall? And how much time did it take them to do that? Day 2. What was that, a wooden wall? I don't see any other explanation for such a rapid destruction of one wall and the instant construction of a second wall. Oh no, not the curtain yet. They were still knocking down here. In addition, it is reported that behind the second wall, The Halicarnassians also erected a wooden tower 45 meters high, on which catapults were placed. Exactly, in the plural form. That's a 15-story building made of wood, assuming the ceilings are 3 meters high. Maybe now the curtain? No. At dawn, the Halicarnassians made a sortie with a force of 2,000 hoplites and almost defeated the Macedonians. But the desperate situation of the Macedonians was saved by the veterans who had been exempted from fighting due to their age. Forming up so tightly that their shields overlapped, they held back the Persian assault. That was a quote from Wikipedia. The phrase I liked the most was,
"Veterans free."
If they were released from combat because of age, why were they even in the army? Were they just making sure their pensions were paid on time? In the end, the Persians retreated to the islands in the sea, burning everything behind them that could be burned. Macedonians entered the empty city and destroyed it once again. Personally, I admire Plutarch in the sense that he didn't want to take on so many lies in describing the battle, which cannot be said about other historians, for example, about Diodorus Siculus. What is important for us in this event are several key details. First, the city itself, its surroundings, and its Acropolis, which historians mention repeatedly. Look at them. If someone sees clearly protruding pyramid-like structures under these hills, it's probably just an overactive imagination and an optical illusion. Just like this cave, which looks more like a gate leading into the hill, and these windmills standing on the top. The second capture of the city was important in itself, for unknown reasons. No historian mentions these reasons. Something clearly happened here that doesn't fit into canonical definitions. And because of this, most historians simply lied wholeheartedly, while Plutarch didn't even want to get involved with this story. Aleksandr was clearly in a hurry to go somewhere. Otherwise, there was no way to explain the fact that he left a strong, undefeated army in his rear and rushed on, leaving only 3,500 men, to besiege the small group of defenders left in the Acropolis and to fight Memnon's army, which, by the way, continued to trouble him for a long time afterwards, while the tiny Acropolis held out under siege for another whole year. Well, let's get back to Plutarch. Aleksandr quickly advanced along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, the sea. Many were surprised by this fact, since real mountains had finally appeared in his path. This gave rise to rumors that he was moving along the bottom of the sea, which parted before him. Yes, not only Moses managed to pull off such a trick. However, to be fair, Plutarch says that Aleksandr himself did not speak of any miracle. And in response to the question, he said that he simply walked along some staircase, a secret path, thus coming straight to the city of Phaselis. He spent several days there and once again visited cultural landmarks, just like a true tourist. After such a rest, he once again moved from the sea inland, capturing Pisidia and Phrygia along the way. Then he took the city of Gordium, where the famous chariot with the knot that no one had been able to untie stood. Legend has it that Aleksandr simply cut this knot, which is where the expression "to cut the Gordian knot" comes from. However, Plutarch writes that in fact Aleksandr solved this task quite cleverly and honestly. Then Aleksandr captured Paphlagonia and Cappadocia. Well, basically, he entertained himself as best he could. And what was the Persian king Darius doing all this time, huh? He had already learned about Aleksandr's rampages and was moving with a huge army towards the sea. And here another seemingly not so obvious question arose. On the one hand, we observe how for almost a year Aleksandr rampaged across the territory of Persia and did so practically with impunity. No one saw his landing across the Hellespont. Almost all the cities surrendered without a fight, And the only army that came out against him in the field was half as large, about 20,000 against 45,000. But we remember that the Persian armies, which periodically came to Greece, were enormous, sometimes numbering almost 1,000,000. Where did they all go? Plutarch reports that almost the entire army was with Darius and numbered about 600,000 soldiers. But then a second question arises. An army usually stays where the greatest danger is expected, either where it is easy to reach any border of the country with equal speed, or as another option, where it can safely survive a global catastrophe, so that later, after coming out of shelter, it can engage the enemy in combat. Darius's army was located on the very southeastern border of the Persian Empire, so draw your own conclusions as to why it was there on its own. Maybe you will have a different opinion. But be that as it may, the two armies were steadily approaching each other. Alexander's 45,000 strong army and Darius's 600,000 strong armada. And now there is very little distance left between them, but once again the circus with the horses begins. Aleksandr is forced to go through a narrow gorge between mountain ranges. And in such a position, he has an advantage, similar to the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. But he moves forward instead of waiting for Darius to fall into the trap. Darius, being right in front of the mountains on the plain, can deploy his entire armada and meet the Macedonians in a favorable position. But instead, he sends all his troops to meet Aleksandr. It would seem that both armies are making a tactical mistake, abandoning a favorable position and rushing into a trap. What's more, for some reason they do this at night and the impossible happens. Two armadas in a narrow gorge at night pass by each other without noticing. When the Tsars realize what has happened, the situation changes. The armies turn around and start going back. And so at the exit of the gorge, they finally meet. The Battle of Issus began. Official historians try to explain this by referring to Arrian, saying that Darius's army went around the mountain range. However, Plutarch writes in black and white that the Macedonians realized they had missed each other only when they reached Darius's deserted camp. That is, there was no detour, and the armies were moving directly toward each other. But the circus with the horses remained. Instead of blocking the gorge with a phalanx of spearmen, which would have neutralized the advantage, Aleksandr bypasses the 600,000 strong army on the right along a suddenly formed
passable mountains
and strikes the Persians from the rear. For understanding, 600,000 against 45 means, on average, 12 Persians for every Macedonian. Imagine you're approaching a gate and 12 not-so-bright characters come out to meet you. Without thinking too long, you flank them and strike from behind. That's roughly what it looks like. Here's another example. In the area where the battle took place, it's only about 7 or 8 kilometers from the mountains to the sea. To prevent the phalanx from being outflanked, you need to line them up in a single line from the mountains to the sea. If each hoplite in a tight formation takes up no more than half a meter, it would take 15,000 men to form a single solid line. That means the line of Macedonian phalanx was only 2 men deep. Otherwise, gaps would appear through which the Macedonians could easily be surrounded. And opposing this thin human line would be an equally dense Persian formation, but with more than 30 ranks in depth. 2 against 30 along the entire front line. At the same time, these two Macedonians had to hold 5 to 6 meter long phalanx spears. However, Aleksandr or the historians did not pay any attention to this nuance, and he outflanked Darius's army with cavalry from the rear. Moreover, according to some sources, in the middle of the battle, among more than 500,000 fighters, Aleksandr somehow found Darius and engaged him in combat. He was wounded in the leg by him, but nevertheless, he routed the Persians, killing about 110,000 enemies. He himself rode after the fleeing Darius with his wounded leg, and unsurprisingly did not catch up with him, since Darius himself had been a simple messenger in his youth. I bet you didn't know about this? Let me reiterate, 500,000 Persians led by their king are fleeing in fear from 40,000 Macedonians. Indeed, the Persians, led by their king, are fleeing in fear from 40,000 Macedonians. I'm not a colonel, of course, but in my opinion, something like that is only possible in the case of total superiority of one side over the other. For example, if every Macedonian was armed and armored, and every Persian was unarmed and naked, then it's not an army, but a crowd of unarmed refugees. And that's not a battle, it's a massacre. Or maybe that's how it really was. One way or another, Aleksandr, having taken the Persians' captured riches, now continued to move slowly along the sea, further and further south, as if he had forgotten about the 500,000 crowd of refugees behind him. Forget the army, Daria. The first thing that was captured was Damascus. As Plutarch reports, money, provisions, the wives and children of the Persians were taken there. In other words, everything that belonged to them. And again, the question arises, if all the property of the Persians was in Damascus, then what was Darius doing with the army in Susa? The only explanation that personally makes any sense to me for this whole circus with the horses is that Darius was gathering the people who survived after some kind of global catastrophe with the goal of moving everyone to a more suitable place for living. That is, the 600,000 Persians were just ordinary residents, naturally refugees with their belongings, wives, and children, whom the specially trained Special Purpose Mobility Unit troops of Aleksandr simply scattered like kittens. By the way, it's not surprising that it was exactly Ganets, who apparently was supposed to run around the ruined empire in search of survivors, who became King Darius. This conclusion is almost self-evident. An additional confirmation of this is the haste with which the young Aleksandr rushed to attack Persia. He knew that he had to act as quickly as possible before the survivors organized themselves. He also knew that although there were 500,000 enemies behind him, they posed no threat to him. And then Aleksandr began to act exactly as he should have. Plutarch occupied the entire coastal fertile territory, including the suddenly deserted Egypt. Plutarch repeatedly mentions a certain nameless deity who helps Aleksandr make decisions. Time passed, Aleksandr occupied Egypt, founded Alexandria, and in general, life was getting better. Out of all those events, I think it's necessary to mention one in particular, namely the letter from Darius to Aleksandr, in which he offered 10,000 talents as ransom and all the lands west of the Euphrates. That is, the most profitable and fertile ones, one of his daughters as a wife, and also friendship and alliance. Can you imagine how desperate the situation must have been for the king, commanding a 500,000 strong army, to offer something like that? In fact, he was giving everything to Aleksandr without a fight, but Aleksandr wanted even more. He suggested that Darius come himself and surrender his authority. Otherwise, he would go after Darius himself. That's exactly what happened. 2 years after the Battle of Issus, Aleksandr had conquered all the territories that Darius had promised to give him, and the two armies met again. Some historians claim that this happened near the city of Arbela, but Plutarch says that the battle took place at Gaugamela. In any case, it's not that important, since both locations are relatively close to each other. finally an honest battle on the plain. Darius didn't waste any time, and during that period increased his army to 1 million. The same can't be said about Alexander's army. In fact, nothing can be said about it, since Plutarch doesn't mention anything about it. So, the two armies positioned themselves opposite each other and began preparing to sleep. In the morning, the first order given was about breakfast. But that's understandable. War is war, but meals and sleep are according to schedule. The battle itself is described too vaguely, as if in a drug-induced haze. The armies have clashed, but Aleksandr is still in the rear having breakfast. Here, the left flank, under the command of Parmenion, was bypassed by the Persian cavalry, which then rushed to loot the Macedonian baggage train instead of surrounding the phalanx. Now, Parmenion sent a messenger to Aleksandr with this news and a request for help. Here, Aleksandr refused Parmenion and engaged in a long, thoughtful conversation with the Thessalians and other Greeks, while at the same time putting on his helmet. The messenger had already returned to Parmenion with Aleksandr's reply, and the enemy cavalry was just approaching the Macedonian camp. Finally, Aleksandr finished chatting with the Thessalians and led his phalanx into the center of the enemy army. All this time, the Persians apparently were either fighting among themselves or obediently waiting for Aleksandr to finish talking. The phalanx went through the Persians like a knife through butter and moved straight toward Darius. He didn't try to be a hero and ran away again. Now Parmenion is asking for help again, and Aleksandr stops chasing Darius, hurrying to help his friend. But on the way, they learn that Parmenion has already won. All of this is practically verbatim quotes from Plutarch. But if someone wants more details, either read it yourself or wait until I model this battle in detail. After this, I respected Plutarch even more, who demonstratively refuses to convey the tiniest details of battles, as if he doesn't want to take part in outright dirty lies. After this battle, Aleksandr calmly reached Susa and took control of it. Then he moved directly into Persia, towards the city of Persepolis, which was defended by many noble Persians. And Darius didn't even try to defend it. He ran away again. Well, screw it. After taking Persepolis, Aleksandr finally decided to rest and let his troops rest as well. For 4 months, there were no battles at all. But then news arrived that one of Darius's generals, a certain Bess, had started a rebellion, overthrown Darius, taken him captive, and declared himself the Persian king. Outraged by such blatant audacity, Aleksandr immediately set off in pursuit. Crossing more than 500 kilometers through the mountains, he caught up with Bess, but Bess fled, abandoning his baggage and leaving the mortally wounded Darius behind. He died in the arms of Aleksandr's servant, literally just a few minutes before his arrival. Bess was captured and executed, being torn in half, although other sources report different methods of his execution. And here we come across one of the very important details in Plutarch's account. It is obvious that Plutarch deliberately disguised this chapter as a seemingly insignificant discussion about trousers and costumes, which he began to wear while in Parthia. Aleksandr, just a couple of lines which are further disguised by the mention of diarrhea that afflicted Aleksandr. By the way, this is chapter 45. Here Plutarch mentions for the first time that it's a quote. Soon,
Before the described
events here. Suffering from diarrhea, he crossed the river Exar, which Zatanais had mistaken for, and having turned the Scythians to flight, pursued them on horseback for a full 100 stadia. Indeed, who among those recalling baggy trousers and diarrhea will pay attention to the fact that Aleksandr fought the Scythians in the area of the Tanais River? And how could he confuse one river, on which he had never been, with another river on which he also supposedly had never been? and also while fighting the Scythians, whom he had never fought. I suppose someone will definitely take this information into account, hiding behind the claim that it supposedly comes from open sources. In the next chapter 46, Plutarch once again emphasizes that the quote, Alexander himself, in a detailed letter to Antipater, says that the king of the Scythians gave him his daughter as a wife. But immediately after this, he seems to cover up this information with the words of Lysimachus, spoken several years later, saying that these are supposedly fabrications. With this, I conclude the second part of the analysis of Alexander's life. But this is not the end yet. To be continued. Friends, none of us are immune to mistakes. And if you see a mistake in my logic, don't hesitate. Clearly, correctly, and without hesitation, leave your angry comment under the video. To be continued.